Right, so here we are again. I met Nick, 3-4 years ago after Daphne had hired me for Founders Forum for Good. And he was this shining example of what tech entrepreneurs could be if they put their mind to doing good. So I'm really delighted to have you here, Nick. And I'm going to let you do most of the talking. So could you maybe just tell us about your journey? Like, so you started Moonpig.
Yeah, yeah.
Talk to me about where you came from and where you are now, really.
Yeah, I mean, when I started, I mean, I spent a few years as a commodity trader in Russia, came back and made the obvious transition into selling greeting cards. I went into that because the internet had just started, and I wanted an internet webby thing, and making smutty greeting cards seemed to be the answer to that. So so set up Moonpig, and then, you know, the usual struggle, sort of 4 or 5 years of losing money, almost going bankrupt, and then we started making money. By about 2008, 2009, we were making shed loads of money and throwing it off as dividends, and I was thinking, you know, I wasn't doing very much with it. And, and then I went skiing and I fell off a cliff. So I mean, it's a bit silly because the guy had said, when I say a cliff, it was about from there to there. So it's not like a massive cliff. It was a big enough cliff, so I landed at the bottom and I couldn't feel my arms and legs, and I thought, I can't believe it. You know, the guy did actually say, there's a cliff over there, don't go over the cliff. I went over the cliff, lying at the bottom, looking up through this hole in the snow, a little bit like one of those cartoon characters that sort of, you know, falls off a cliff, and thinking, I can't breathe, I can't feel anything, this is probably it, panicking slightly. And then in this sort of moment of a near-death experience, weird things come into your head. And the one thing I thought was, as a bit stupid, I haven't made any plans whatsoever. I'm going to have very, very lucky in life, made a lot of money, and all that's going to go to waste because I haven't made any plans for it whatsoever. And then I realized I just winded myself, so it was fine. So I had all of the benefits of a near-death experience and the clarity that comes with that, but without actually any of the pain that is associated with it. So I broke my sunglasses. But so after that, I went home and I wrote a will. And I wrote my will, and I thought I'll set up a foundation, and then I'll take a couple of weeks off to solve all the problems of the world, and then I'll be done. So that's 9 years ago, still working at it. And it made me think about a lot of things. I mean, one, we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to make as much money as possible. We spend very little of our time working out what the hell we will actually do if that happens. And you think, at the time, I didn't have any kids. And I thought, if I leave it all to my niece, she'll spend it all on Peppa Pig products. And will that really help her? I don't know. So I started thinking about it, and I realized that what would have given me some comfort in those moments when I actually thought that I was dying but wasn't, is it would have been given me some comfort to think, I've sorted that. I know that actually the result of all the work that I've put in over these years is X. So I just had to find out what X is. What is that really good cause? So I set up the foundation, and when I sold the company in 2011, I dumped some money into it and started giving money away. Then I had the opportunity to work as the CEO of a charity for a year, and then I remained as a trustee for a few years. And that was my moment when I realized actually that you know, you think, when you start this journey, yay, I made some money, I'm going to save all the problems of the world, and then you get stuck in and you think, oh God, this is actually a hell of a lot more complicated than everyone told me. This is really quite difficult. And you sort of, everybody has the same journey. You're going to slump down and think, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. And then you learn more, and then you kind of come back out the other side. So it was a bit of, it's like my MBA in the world of charity. And I learned, you know, charities tell us a lot of things about you know, just £10 can transform the lives of thousands of people. That's because they're not really subject to advertising standards authority. And in truth, you know, there's a lot of things I came to realize during that journey. One is that I asked myself lots of questions. I stood back and you think, first you have to ask yourself, how else is this problem being addressed? Who else is doing something about it? The reality is that we live in a society now, having moved away from Victorian philanthropy and moved into a society where we decide collectively that, right, how much money do we need to raise between us to solve all the problems of our society, and how are we going to, and who's going to cough up what? And then we have an election, and we vote based on a budget. So if we got that right, then theoretically we wouldn't really need any charity to solve the world's problems. But then I realized actually that some of us are lucky and we end up with more money than we really need, and it doesn't really matter even if we solve that problem, we will still want to give. So philanthropy is as much about our need to give as it is about the need itself. You know, the amount of money given doesn't change because the need increases. It's actually a lot to do with the fact that you think, right, I've got as much money as I need and I've got some surplus, and I would get more satisfaction out of doing something useful with it. So, but it's very, very important to understand when working out what to give in a developed society, let's say in Britain, everything that you're funding philanthropically is something that the government has chosen not to fund with taxpayers' money. So you have to ask yourself why. And am I just putting the icing on the cake? You know, we spend $400 billion a year in this country dealing with health, education, and welfare. And we give about $6 billion of philanthropy on top of that. So if the only role of philanthropy is merely to add an extra 1.5% into that pot, it really is doing very little. So I wanted to ask myself about what is the real role of the money? How do I get the best bang for buck out of my philanthropy? And I realized it kind of divides up into a number of different purposes. Philanthropy can either use its kind of agility and nimbleness to come up with much better solutions to make sure that the other 97% of the money that we spend on solving our problems is spent better, and that is probably the most useful thing. You know, it's much better to come up with a much cheaper, better solution for a problem than it is merely to keep throwing money at the old solution. The other thing is there are some things that are just the icing on the cake. You know, we accept that taxpayers can pay so much of something, but if you want to put clowns into hospitals and cheer up kids, probably not the taxpayer's responsibility. It doesn't mean to say it's a bad thing, but it is just the icing on the cake. And the third thing is sometimes you just want to share a passion. And I heard a story, a friend of mine had a godfather who lost both his legs in the Second World War, and he left his entire estate to a ballet school because that was the one thing that he could never do, and he wanted other people to be able to do that. I think, is that wrong? You know, is it because it's not the most effective? Is it saving the most lives? No, but he wanted to share his passion. So there's no right or wrong about that, but you kind of have to choose it. And I didn't have a particular cause or passion to go for. So it was a bit of a process of analysis. And I kind of did actually in the end come to the conclusion that I wanted to work out how I could go for the lowest hanging fruit. How am I going to go for the most effective way of increasing human happiness? Then there's this question of, does it matter how near these people are to me, or does it matter how far away? They're all human beings. And I concluded, you know what, I pay a lot of taxes, that sorts out a lot of problems in this country, and we're all human beings are equal. So I wanted to go for countries where they didn't have the money, where I could have more bang for buck. So that is why I chose to look more at the developing world. And then I figured, okay, loads of people must have tried to address the question of what's the lowest hanging fruit? And you know, first one on that, what does Bill Gates think about this? And he's obviously spent a lot of time trying to work out the lowest hanging fruit: HIV, malaria, and polio, TB, all of these things. And of course, you know, even some of these vaccinations are things that even local governments in those countries can afford to do. And I'm not going to be paying to subsidize a government to do what they can afford to do with their meager budget. So I wanted to look for things that were probably maybe not being addressed by, you know, the things that kill people are being addressed by a lot of charities. Nice and easy, we can say we've saved these lives. And then there are a few things in between which are just debilitating. And we heard about schistosomiasis, river blindness, and various other things. And one of the things that I wanted to look at was surgery. So I did a bit of research into this. So, sorry, I'm rambling on here. You said I could do most of the talking.
I'm happy to.
That's a dangerous thing to say.
But I want to. So I get you wanted to do the developing world, but stumbling onto surgery is so how did you stumble onto it?
Okay, so what I was looking at, I actually read a lot of reports, Lancet reports and other things, and realized that although a lot of money has gone into killer diseases, as a result, money has been sucked out of surgery. And if you look at the interventions, and the way that medical interventions are judged is based on the cost per disability adjusted life year. Now, this is something, you know, people will say, oh, you can't put a price on a life. Well, you can, and you have to. If you've got a budget, you've got to work out how best to spend your resources. And some of these interventions, if you look at them as a cost per disability adjusted life year, the basic breakdown of this is if you've got a 5-year-old child who's dying of a disease and you can cure it with one pill, that child's going to last for 80 years. And in this country, we can spend about £30,000 per disability adjusted life year. We can afford to spend £2.4 million saving that child's life if you're confident he's going to have a good life. If, on the other hand, giving him that pill will mean he's alive but severely brain damaged, then someone has to decide, well, how much do you discount that by? Is it 50%, 60%, 70%? So there are teams of people who do that, and there are lists. You know, the United Nations World Health Authority organization has lists of what they consider to be the right level of disability. Now, so I went through this and I found obstetric fistula. Hands up, everyone who knows what obstetric fistula is. Oh, good for you hands. But for those of you who don't, pretty disgusting thing. Unfortunately, generally amongst young women who have an obstructive birth, it creates, basically, kills the tissue, usually between the urethra and the birth canal, or the rectum and the birth canal, and as a result, they're often singly or doubly incontinent, and these 16-year-old girls will probably spend the rest of their life smelling of pee and poo, and they will be ostracized from society, and they won't be able to work, and they certainly don't have a love life, and they don't have a social life, and they don't die of it. They just have a really, really crap life. And 65% of that can be sorted for around about £400, okay? So you think, wow. And there are 1 million women. I mean, you could say, of course, let's change midwifery so that this doesn't happen, but there's still a backlog of about 1 million to 2 million women roaming around Africa having a really, really crap time. So if you can fix that relatively easily, that's a pretty good one. So then you have to start thinking, okay, if it was as simple as that, you know, we could just throw money at that all day. One of the problems in this country, in Africa, is not money. It's the shortage of surgical capacity. It's the shortage of surgeons who can actually do that operation. So they think, okay, fine, I would love to fund this, provided we can address the question of capacity. Can we get more surgeons? Because there is no point in me paying a surgeon to do that operation if all he's going to do is not do another operation. So there's this question of net benefit. You have to be really confident when you're funding something that the net benefit to society is positive, as opposed to merely reshuffling the pack. And you see this all the time. Charities talk about the benefit that they have created. They don't necessarily talk about the negative knock-on effects of what they're doing. And of course, you know, are they merely diverting resources from one place to another? So basically what I concluded was that my next falling off the cliff moment, if I ever fall off another cliff, and I'm not giving up skiing, so that might happen, is that if all of my money went into curing fistula, I'd be kind of happy with that as a result of my life's work. And so that's my falling off the cliff fund.
So thank you for that story, Nick. It's really helpful. So you approach it like an entrepreneur would. When you look at a host of interventions, you find out where you think you can have the most impact, the most leverage, where you can turn the right levers to get things done, and then you support that. So how have you, aside from money, gotten engaged with organizations?
Okay, so what I did is I looked at the market, and that's the first thing you got to do, starting point, look at who's trying to solve this problem. There are about 7 organizations trying to solve that problem. What I realized was that most of them were counting their results in terms of surgeries they had completed. Nobody was counting it in terms of how many women had a better life. And actually the real outcome is the only reason you're doing this is, do women have a better life? So I found somebody who was doing it, who was seemed to be brighter and more switched on, a guy called Seth Cochran, who set up Operation Fistula. And we got chatting, and we're on the same wavelength. So we said, well, why don't we create a medical registry for measuring patients from the start of the process all the way through, make it tablet-based, work with the surgeons. We can, one, work out which surgeons and which clinics are more effective, and therefore which ones we want to fund more. And the other thing is we can also audit it, so that we can use a bit of biometric data to work out the patient from the start to the finish. And we can audit X% of these things. So it means you can pay on a case-by-case basis, and you can fund with confidence, knowing you haven't got a corrupt surgeon who's actually charged five or six fistula surgeries for doing the same case. So there was an element of, that's what it needed. It needed an element of accountability. So my starting point was to work with him and develop the GOFA, which is the Global Obstetric Fistula Electronic Registry, GOFA for short, and then speak to all the other fistula charities and say, guys, wouldn't it be a good idea if we shared data? And if you use this system too, everybody gets the results back, and everybody's a winner. And it's really about trying to create a sort of gold standard of measurement. And then with that in place, we could be relatively confident about throwing more money into the pot of actually funding surgeries. So now hopefully GOFA will be used by certainly about 75% of the organizations that are funding fistula surgery around the country. So there was some of that strategically was where I got involved. I mean, you know, I'm always very wary of getting, you know, we all want to, I want to save the world, I want to give more than just my money. The reality is, I used to make smutty greeting cards for a living, so what do I know? I mean, I can ask the right questions, but you have to work with people who've really dedicated their lives to this. You know, people have given up their, they spend the whole of their lives understanding the subject, and you have to, an element of humility is quite important. So it's great to ask questions, it's bad to dictate.
And so how do you compare what you're doing with Operation Fistula to the whole host of potential other interventions that exist in the world? So we've talked about randomized control trials, we've talked about measurement and evidence and comparison. So, you know, where for you, so how do you make the decision that this is the thing, as opposed to giving to something else?
Well, so I read a lot of research on the assessments of the relative cost of per disability-adjusted life year of various different interventions, which is strangely interesting. And some things are quite expensive. So I realised this was one of the ones that was slightly underfunded because, again, it's not a killer, it's debilitating. And that's why we talk about neglected tropical diseases, because they've been neglected partly because it's not a killer. It's just people have a better life, and it's difficult to measure. So that was how I chose that, that one in particular.
Yeah. So you're using a similar framework to we are to think about neglectedness. This is a scalable thing, a tractable thing, something that is evidence-backed and that I can turn levers for.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of evidence, sometimes you have to do things in order to get evidence. So you have to have a hypothesis. I think this will do this, and this is what I want to measure. You can't only ever back things on the basis of results. Someone has to pioneer this stuff. Right. And actually, philanthropy is much better. It's much more agile money. It's much better at pioneering stuff and saying, look, okay, it may not work. There's a whole load of stuff that, I do lots of early stage ventures. As you all know, not all of them work. But you hope some of them will.
Right. So it's about the incubation of ideas and then potentially opening up larger sources of funding. And
then providing evidence that gives other people the confidence to follow on with bigger money.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. So I have a couple of questions. Everyone in this room can attest to the strains and pressures of growing a company, of course. What one piece of advice would you give to our members about balancing business versus giving back?
One, I've realized it's a lot easier to give back when you're making money. Got to make some to give it to give it away. It's a very logical thing. I mean, at first, Bill Gates once said that if he become a doctor, he could have helped a certain number of people. He's actually very good at making money. There's nothing wrong with just focusing on the business, because the more money you make, the more you can give away.
Awesome. That's what I wanted to hear. So what can entrepreneurs and business leaders bring to the table as a force for good, especially in this really weird political time of uncertainty? And that's, e.g., Trump playing out of climate, the way hard Brexit. Like, what role do entrepreneurs have in shaping this conversation in a room full of entrepreneurs?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, I think entrepreneurs are a great community in the sense that we have this natural need to want to get together and discuss things. The very fact that we're all sitting here discussing today how we can make the best use of the money that we either have made or are about to make is one of those very things that we can. We're slightly preaching to the converted here, but actually even having that discussion about well, if I make this, then what is the purpose of money and what would I do with it? Having that discussion amongst other people. And I find sometimes I have some people who've been very successful and they've never given any consideration to when is enough and how much do they need and what should they leave to their kids and how much do they give away. So that even having that discussion amongst other people, other founders, is a good thing.
Good. How do you feel about paying tax?
I feel great about paying tax. I really do. I mean, there are a lot of people who I was given the option when I was selling my company. My accountant automatically assumed I would want to flee to Guernsey or Canada and again sort of sit on a miserable island for 5 years and sweat it out. And I thought, well, for starters, I only made the money because I live in an environment where you can sell a company for 11 times earnings because we have a stable legal system paid for by our taxpayers. So I have no issue at all with paying what I would regard as a reasonable amount of tax. I mean, it might be a different discussion if we went back to where we were in the 1970s. But I do think that, in a sense, before you can start with philanthropy, you kind of pay your dues to society. So I have no issue with that at all.
Good. How much time do you commit to philanthropy? And as a sort of sidecar, if you're willing to talk about it, how much of your wealth have you donated, or do you plan to donate to charity?
Yeah, so the first thing, I probably spend maybe a couple of days a week. I mean, I find it fascinating. The most rewarding thing I've got out of it is that, if you just write the check and forget about it, it's not that rewarding. Well, the most rewarding thing is to really, we've all got inquisitive minds, is to really dig deep and get to understand an issue. And it's so much more rewarding to give when you really understand the issue. The other thing is, I kind of like spending my time with other people who'd like to make the world a better place. Because the alternative is spending your time with other people who are choosing super yachts, and I don't know, I just prefer the former. So you're with a nicer bunch of people. And so I do spend a lot of time discussing this stuff, some of it just because I enjoy discussing it, and some of it because we're actually trying to get stuff done. So I don't know, but it becomes a bit of a way of life.
Okay. And the second question.
Oh, the second question. So I think, I dumped, what did I put? I put about 10% in, 10% of my thing. Initially, I've since topped it up, and every time I sell a company, it's a lot easier to, what I did is created a charitable foundation, which is basically just, it doesn't cost very much to run it, it's basically just a bank account. Once the money's in there, it can only go in one direction. And it's a hell of a lot easier to give it away before it's sat in your bank account for any length of time.
That's what we think as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So have you involved friends or family in your philanthropy?
Well, my family, yes. I mean, I created a family foundation, so I would, if you're not going to leave your money to your children, it's good that they should maybe feel the benefit of being able to do some good with it, as opposed to just thinking he left me nothing, bastard. So I set it up so that there's two things to consider when you're setting up a foundation. One is you want to involve your children. And you want to get them involved. You'd like them to be better human beings. So giving them the chance as they grow older to say, right, you can come to the foundation with ideas for things you want to fund, but you've got to come up with a good argument. Leads them to being better human beings. Ultimately, I would like there to be a spend down. You know, if you don't have a spend down, you create this foundation a bit like, you know, all these foundations that have been going for hundreds of years, and now run by the great and the good who have no connection with the benefactor, and you can only give away the income every year. It makes sense if you are setting it up to think, actually, do I want it to be spent 15 years after my death? I think Bill and Melinda Gates have said that. Or 15 years, or by the time my children are 30, or, you know, got to think about that.
So you want your capital to be productive, as opposed to just sitting in a bank and...
Exactly, yeah.
Got it. Good. So we have a question from Anonymous. And Anonymous asks or says, my co-founder says that they would rather give their time than money to charity. What are your thoughts on having done both?
What I found is that charities often approach me and they say, we'd really, really appreciate your time and your opinion on something. And I say, you can have my time or you can have a check, but you can't have both. What would you rather have? And amazingly, actually, they always ask for the check. But so charities do tend to flatter you into wanting your opinion. But they just really want the money.
Could I have some of your time, Nick?
I put a lot of time in because I just find it fascinating. I mean, the first 4 or 5, 6 years was just learning. You know, to do this properly, you have to learn a lot and do a lot of research, and there's no easy way around that. And I'm still learning, and I still find it fascinating. So a lot of the time I spent in is actually a lot more for my benefit in terms of that I just find it a fascinating subject matter. And I find I have, as a pair of outside eyes, I think, you know, we all have. Well, you know, you're all great problem solvers, so sometimes you look at things from a different angle and say, well, why do you do it that way? And you ask questions, and sometimes they don't have an answer for it, and sometimes they think, you know what, we've never thought of it that way. So there's a lot that you can add in terms of just questioning and querying, and it's the more general strategic stuff. But you do have to have a lot of respect for the knowledge of people who've been in that sector for a very long time. So there's there's very definitely a role, but it's a two-way thing. I mean, you know, you're giving your time is also very satisfying in itself.
So this is a good follow-on question then. You spent time as a CEO of a charity.
Yeah.
Is it harder, easier, different?
I have to say, it was one of the most miserable years of my life. But I think that's partly because as a CEO and founder of running my own thing, I really hate running other people's things. And I was quite respectful of the fact that the founders, the trustees of this, had created this thing over 10 years. And trying to get strategy past 10 different people, whereas previously it was just, right, we're doing that. But setting aside, it was a fascinating experience, and I learned a lot from it. And it was an exaggerated sort of period. But it also made me understand not just about the cause. It made me have to think about fundraising and why do people give and so on. It was fascinating, if a bit frustrating.
So what are your views on impact investing versus philanthropy? Okay,
so I was also served. I spent 4 years on the investment committee of an impact investment fund called Ivy UK. What I've realized is that for real social enterprises, there's actually a lot more money and not enough ideas, and there's some actually quite. The pipeline is not great. But then, so we're investing in these piddling little sort of social enterprises, and then I made an investment in a company called Virtual Stock, which writes software that deals with procurement and stock control in supermarkets, and then it started getting into the NHS. In the NHS, we burn $800 million worth of drugs a year because they go out of date. And the system, you know, all these trusts, has no visibility of who's got what. They just run out, or it goes out of date, and they buy more and burn the old stuff. So this bit of software allows them to see what else is around, and pull in drugs and effectively trade amongst trusts. That alone will probably save the NHS about £500 million a year. which can be released into primary care. Now, virtual stock doesn't see itself as a social enterprise,
but
it's got a great idea which will generate more money for primary care than about 20% of the money that is given across the whole of the UK in philanthropic funds for healthcare. So I question, sometimes you have businesses that just have an amazing social impact, and they don't even call themselves social enterprises. So there's a very blurred line between that. I also, through my foundation, have an investment in a business called Mwabu, which is an African primary school tablet-based education system that can be supplied for £10 per pupil per year, that hopefully will help literacy across Africa. But it's a business. This stuff needs to be paid for, but hopefully by creating that, we'll have a great impact. Now, we'll either everybody will copy our system and we'll make no money out of it, and that's a result, or else it'll be very successful and we'll make money out of it, and then we can give the money back again. So there's a blurred line between investing in great companies that come up with great solutions and things that specifically call themselves social enterprise.
Right. Nick, thank you so much for your time, for your inspiration, for doing what you do. And I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Great.